Henri Désiré Landru's personal life was a facade of respectability, carefully constructed to shield his darkest impulses. Married with 4 children, he presented himself as the archetype of a caring husband and father, a man whose absence from home was explained by business or personal errands. To his family, he was attentive, thoughtful, and even generous, bestowing gifts purchased with the spoils of his crimes, while concealing the origin of his wealth. This duality devoted family man by day, calculated predator by night reveals the cold precision with which Landru compartmentalized his life. Even his wife, Marika Theron, was pulled into his web of deception, living under his alias Fremyot and unknowingly, or perhaps selectively knowing, assisting in fraudulent activities that facilitated his predations. Landru's children, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the depths of their father's malevolence, highlighting the chilling normalcy with which he conducted murder. His eldest son, Maurice, became an unwilling accomplice in the theft of jewelry and creation of cover stories, while his youngest, Charles, moved furniture and admitted to vague gardening work at Verny Willett, a euphemism concealing unspeakable acts. Landru's manipulation extended to those around him with terrifying efficiency. Neighbors noticed the stench rising from his chimney, yet his polite demeanor and careful planning prevented them from fully comprehending the horror occurring inside. He cultivated relationships with women who trusted him implicitly, exploiting their isolation and grief with a sophistication that suggested deep psychological insight. Each interaction, each gesture, was designed to disarm, charm, and conceal the inevitability of their fate. His operations were methodical. Letters were intercepted or forged, financial accounts drained, and his victims' departures orchestrated to leave minimal trace. Beyond the physical act of murder, Landru exerted a psychological control so profound that even investigators initially doubted the full scope of his crimes. His calm, witty demeanor in public, and especially during the trial, created a dissonance between the man the world saw and the atrocities he committed behind closed doors. This mastery of perception ensured his notoriety would only grow as the public grappled with the contradiction of a polite, almost genteel figure capable of unimaginable brutality. Landru's early life and family environment were not merely backdrops to his crimes, they were instruments in a larger, terrifying design, a life built to deceive, manipulate, and annihilate, leaving the outside world blind to the horrors quietly unfolding within his meticulously controlled existence. The transformation of Henri Désiré Landru from an ordinary man into a predator of unspeakable cunning did not happen overnight. It was rooted in his earliest experiences and psychological predispositions. Born in 1869 in Paris, he was a man of average stature, physically unremarkable, short, balding, and stout, but from a young age, he demonstrated a capacity for charm and social manipulation that would later become his deadliest weapon. In adolescence, he worked various modest jobs, learning the rhythms of commerce and human behavior, studying the vulnerabilities of those around him, particularly women, with a cold, calculating eye. Early relationships revealed a mind attuned to deception. He could feign affection, concern, and trustworthiness, lulling others into a false sense of security while quietly testing their boundaries. By adulthood, Landru had mastered the art of appearance, a carefully cultivated elegance, polite manners, and an air of sophistication masked an unrelenting greed and a lack of empathy that would define his adult life. It is in this early pattern of manipulation that we begin to glimpse the blueprint of his crime, selecting women who were isolated, often mourning or financially naive, and methodically drawing them into his orbit. Letters, advertisements, and personal encounters became instruments of entrapment, each interaction carefully designed to reveal wealth, property, and psychological weakness. Once ensnared, the victim was subjected to a regimen of controls so precise it minimized resistance and maximized compliance. Landru maintained schedules, dictated travel arrangements, and even monitored financial transactions to ensure complete dominance. Yet the genius of his predation was not merely in physical coercion, it was the psychological architecture, an uncanny ability to make each woman believe she was choosing him, that her fate was in her own hands, when in reality she had already been selected, evaluated, and condemned. This psychological sophistication allowed him to avoid suspicion for years, exploiting societal blind spots, the isolation of his victims, and the limitations of contemporary law enforcement. Each crime was not only an act of murder, but a meticulously orchestrated exercise in power, greed, and invisibility. Understanding Landru's early life is crucial, for it reveals a mind that turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. Ordinary charm, ordinary appearance, ordinary civility, into a weapon capable of shaping the destinies of dozens of women, their lives extinguished with a precision that continues to fascinate and horrify a century later. By the early 1900s, Landru had refined his methods into a chillingly systematic pattern, one that blurred the line between predation and performance. He lived a dual existence, outwardly a respectable husband and father, inwardly a predator cataloging potential victims with meticulous care. He placed advertisements in newspapers under the guise of seeking companionship, always phrased to attract women who were vulnerable, grieving, or financially independent yet isolated. Once a reply arrived, Landru began an intricate psychological dance, probing for details about inheritance, property, and personal habits. He would invite his targets to correspond in coded letters, sometimes meeting under the pretense of matrimony or partnership, always constructing an illusion of safety and genuine interest. Women would visit his Gambay residence or one of his temporary lodgings, believing themselves on the verge of a secure future, unaware that every movement, every word was being recorded and assessed. Landru's obsession with control extended even to minute details. He bought single train tickets for the women, while he alone purchased return tickets, ensuring their dependency on him and limiting the risk of escape. The crimes themselves, though horrifying, were executed with meticulous cleanliness. Victims were systematically eliminated, their possessions seized, and their physical remains, allegedly burned in his oven, were hidden from view, leaving only fragments to hint at the horror. Landru's calm demeanor and charm shielded him from immediate suspicion. Neighbors noted nothing unusual, and letters to friends and family maintained an illusion of normalcy. The genius and terror of his method lay not just in murder but in invisibility. The victims disappeared without a trace, their lives erased from the world, while Landru continued his daily routines, visiting his wife and children, attending social gatherings, and conducting financial affairs with an unremarkable facade. The French authorities at the time were ill-equipped to detect such an organized, psychologically complex predator. Law enforcement lacked the forensic sophistication and investigative techniques that modern criminology would employ, and the fragmented evidence, stray letters, missing women, faint odors from chimneys, was insufficient to raise immediate alarms. Yet the pattern existed, a signature carved into the very fabric of his interactions, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the trail of deception and death began to coalesce, revealing a predator whose intellect, greed, and cunning transformed ordinary life into a calculated theater of murder. Landru was no mere killer. He was an architect of disappearance, an expert in the art of making life vanish while maintaining the illusion of civility and charm. In the quiet outskirts of Paris in 1869, a child was born who would one day master the art of deception with a precision that would chill France to its core. Henri Désiré Landru entered the world in the shadow of a society on the cusp of modernity. Yet he carried with him a darkness that no one could see. From an early age, he displayed an unsettling blend of charm and cunning, a mind capable of reading people with unnerving clarity. His childhood, though ordinary on the surface, was shaped by a strict household and a father who enforced discipline with a cold hand. Landru's adolescence revealed a fascination with numbers, organization, and the meticulous arrangement of life into lists, inventories, and accounts. He absorbed the patterns of human behavior, learning how to manipulate desires and vulnerabilities without leaving a trace of suspicion. By his early 20s, Landru had left school and begun his first ventures into small frauds and schemes, testing the limits of trust, identity, and legal boundaries. He was not a man of brute force. His weapons were patience, calculation, and a complete lack of empathy for those he ensnared. Women, he learned, were portals into wealth and security, and Landru's keen eye for opportunity became apparent in the way he presented himself as respectable, dependable, and charming, a man whose promises seemed tangible, whose presence suggested safety, and whose hands could provide a future. Beneath this calm veneer, he meticulously studied society's rules, learning to exploit the blind spots of bureaucracy, the inefficiency of institutions, and the moral certainties of ordinary people. By the time he entered adulthood, had already formed a method, a pattern that would later define his infamous crimes: the careful targeting of women, the orchestration of deception, and the cold, systematic elimination of obstacles. His early life, seemingly mundane, was in fact a crucible of observation, calculation, and the cultivation of a mind capable of not only committing atrocities, but also masking them with the thin veneer of ordinary civility. This is the story of a man who turned charm into a weapon, civility into a trap, and greed into murder, a man who would become known as the Bluebeard of Gambay, whose crimes were hidden in plain sight, and whose victims vanished behind the most ordinary of facades. As Landru stepped into adulthood, his path became a calculated dance of opportunity and manipulation. He moved through Paris, not as a shadow, but as a presence unnoticed, yet always observing, cataloguing, and weighing the vulnerabilities around him. His early schemes were small but revealing: forged signatures, minor thefts, and the careful exploitation of acquaintances' trust. Yet these petty deceptions were only rehearsals for what would become his true method: a meticulous, predatory system that preyed on women seeking companionship, security, or escape. He understood the societal pressures of post-war France, the loneliness that haunted widows and middle-aged women, and he used these invisible wounds as his entry point. Advertisements in newspapers became his net, letters from hopeful women his bait, and a courteous, reassuring voice his hook. He was patient, allowing the women to reveal their lives, their assets, and their weaknesses, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted suitor. Landru's charm was a carefully crafted performance, each gesture and word calculated to disarm suspicion. He presented himself as a man of stability and taste, someone who could offer guidance and security. Yet beneath the polished exterior, his mind was already cataloguing escape routes, disposal methods, and financial gain. By the time he invited his first victims to Gambay, a small, secluded village outside Paris, he had refined the mechanics of control. The house became a theater of deception, where appearances masked sinister intent, and normality hid the machinery of murder. Each woman he lured was evaluated for potential wealth, vulnerability, and compliance. Those deemed unsuitable were discarded or avoided. But for those he selected, the stage was set, and Landru's control extended far beyond financial manipulation. Orchestrated absence, disappearance, and death with chilling precision. The era's limited forensic technology and bureaucratic inefficiencies worked in his favor. A man who maintained social appearances, kept receipts, and signed documents, with care could evade suspicion for years. Landru's early crimes were more than opportunistic theft. They were the blueprint for the methodical destruction of lives, executed with a calm precision that made the eventual horrors almost inevitable. What emerges from this period is not only the portrait of a criminal mind, but also the disturbing recognition that charm, civility, and societal compliance can be weaponized into instruments of death. Henri Landru did not stumble into murder. He engineered it, building a network of manipulation, deceit, and cruelty that would later terrify France, leaving questions that linger to this day about how evil can hide behind the mask of the ordinary dot. By 1915, Landru had refined his system into a cold, unfeeling machine. War had left countless women widowed, lonely, and desperate, their grief and vulnerability serving as the perfect camouflage for his predation. He advertised for wives, promising companionship and stability, yet the letters that arrived were carefully filtered through his meticulous records. Landru categorized each woman, noting wealth, social connections, and personal weaknesses, as if preparing chess pieces for a game only he understood. He selected those who could be manipulated without resistance, women whose possessions could be appropriated with minimal risk. Once a target was chosen, he drew her into his orbit through the illusion of romance, cultivating trust with small attentions and polite gestures. Travel arrangements were calculated. He purchased single tickets for his victims while keeping return journeys for himself, ensuring they could not easily escape. Once they arrived at his Gambay residence, the house itself became an instrument of control. Landru maintained a routine, offering meals, conversation, and the appearance of normalcy while carefully monitoring every action. Behind the walls, however, he had already designed the mechanics of disappearance. Bodies were never found, but witnesses recalled the smell of decay and smoke, hinting at the unimaginable acts carried out within the walls of that house. Letters to family and friends were manipulated or destroyed, ensuring the trail went cold almost immediately. For Landru, murder was transactional, a means to an end, a way to secure wealth and assert control without attracting suspicion. The psychological element was as important as the practical. His victims were kept off balance, unsure of the reality around them, compliant by fear or trust, believing themselves in safe hands. He extended this control through forged signatures, bank account manipulation, and careful financial management, all executed under the guise of propriety. Landru's audacity lay not only in his crimes, but in the banality with which he carried them out. The neighborhood saw him as a polite, well-dressed man, a devoted father and husband, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator calculating each movement, each decision, each death. The intersection of charm, intelligence, and ruthless. Ambition created a perfect storm, a mechanism of annihilation hidden beneath civility. By the time the first disappearances raised questions, Landru's network of deceit was too intricate, his methods too disciplined, and the evidence too obscured, ensuring his continued freedom and the terrifying escalation of his crimes. Each woman who entered his house unknowingly stepped into a theater where the final act was written in fire, smoke, and silence, leaving a legacy of terror that would haunt investigators and the public alike. By 1915, Landru had perfected his predatory system into a chilling routine that few could have imagined. The backdrop of World War I created both opportunity and obscurity. Countless men were away at the front, leaving women isolated, fearful, and financially vulnerable. Landru exploited this absence with surgical precision. He would target widows and middle-aged women, particularly those who had inherited money or property, approaching them under the guise of courtship and protection. His letters were calculated, polite, empathetic, sometimes flirtatious, but always with an undercurrent of subtle control. He asked for personal details, probed financial status, and studied habits, seemingly caring while meticulously mapping their weaknesses. Once trust was established, he would orchestrate meetings in Gambay or in rented countryside houses, places stripped of witnesses and escape routes. Inside, he executed his plan, isolating the women, subtly administering drugs or coercion, and then committing murder. The disposal of the bodies was as methodical as the initial contact. He reportedly dismembered and incinerated victims in his wood-burning oven, erasing almost all traces. What remains are fragments, whispers, and the faint smell neighbors recalled, but dismissed, until investigators, years later, pieced together the horrid pattern. Landru's financial obsession dictated every step. He stole jewelry, money, and property, keeping meticulous accounts of each transaction, each purchase, each small expense, as if the arithmetic of greed gave order to his chaos. What is particularly disturbing is the psychological duality he maintained. To his wife and children, he was a devoted family man, thoughtful, present, a provider. To his victims, he was a charming suitor and guardian of their confidence. In private correspondence and diary notes, Landru even described his own behavior as an art, a perverse performance that required patience, intelligence, and discretion. The elegance of his outward life shielded him from suspicion for years, allowing the death toll to rise while Paris remained oblivious. Yet, as letters, missing persons reports, and small inconsistencies began to accumulate, the illusion of the gentleman predator began to fracture. Law enforcement, initially blind to the connections, started noticing that multiple women who had disappeared had one link: Henri Désiré. The evidence, however, remained circumstantial. Neighbors reported foul odors from chimneys, bank clerks remembered suspicious withdrawals, and the odd furniture delivery was questioned. But the true horror of Landru's crimes, the systematic erasure of human life for money and control, remained invisible. The genius and the terror of his operation lay in this invisibility. The world saw a polite man with a family, while women disappeared and the machinery of death and theft ran silently behind closed doors. Landru's methodical cruelty deepened as he refined the mechanics of his killings. He became almost surgical, understanding the vulnerabilities of his victims and exploiting them with psychological precision. Each woman received a tailored approach, letters that mirrored her desires, promises that aligned with her fears, gestures of empathy that masked his true intent. He studied them like specimens, noting habits, finances, and routines. Once he secured her trust, he would isolate her from society, bringing her to his Gambay residence or another rented house where no neighbor could intervene. There, the transformation from charming suitor to calculating predator occurred. Accounts from neighbors later described the faint but persistent stench rising from his chimneys. Dismissed at the time as a byproduct of daily life, yet it was the silent signature of his methodical annihilation. Landru didn't rely on brute force alone. His manipulations often involved subtle threats, emotional coercion, and, in some cases, drugs to weaken resistance. After the act, the disposal of evidence was meticulous. Furniture was moved, letters shredded, and bodies dismembered and burned in his wood-burning oven. Fragments were scattered or carefully hidden, creating layers of misdirection that would later challenge investigators. Each act was recorded in his personal notebooks, not in terms of guilt or remorse, but in the currency of profit. What was stolen, what was spent, what could be hidden. This obsessive accounting was as much a part of the ritual as the murders themselves. Beyond greed, there was a disturbing artistry to his methods. Landru created a dual existence, the outwardly respectable husband and father, delivering gifts to his children and attending social obligations, contrasted sharply with the cold precision of his crimes. His family remained largely unaware, shielded by his meticulous separation of public and private lives. Yet, this duality is key to understanding the psychological control he exerted not only over his victims, but over perception itself. He managed to manipulate an entire city's view of him, controlling narrative and suspicion with the same hand that planned murder. When investigators finally began to connect disappearances, the magnitude of Landru's operation became apparent. Letters, financial irregularities, and skeletal fragments began forming a pattern too precise to ignore. And yet, even as evidence mounted, the absence of full bodies kept doubt alive in the minds of some. Genius and horror of Landru lay not merely in his killings, but in the invisible network of deception, manipulation, and greed that allowed him to operate undetected. His crimes weren't impulsive, they were engineered, refined over years. A blueprint for predatory genius hidden in plain sight. Henri Désiré Landru's first known victim, Jean Couchet, was a woman in her early 40s, cautious yet trusting, enough to respond to the marriage ads he placed in local newspapers. He approached her with patience, letters meticulously crafted to echo her hopes of security and companionship. Once she agreed to meet, Landru arranged a journey to his Gambay property, a quiet house removed from scrutiny. On arrival, he welcomed her with the polished manners that had drawn her in, offering polite conversation and a warm, paternal air. Behind closed doors, however, the ritual began. Landru's preparation was precise. Letters and possessions were catalogued, accounts noted, and he ensured no trace of the victim's movements remained outside his control. Jean was isolated, her communications cut off, her trust exploited to the fullest. At some point, the act of murder was executed in the kitchen or the specially prepared rooms of his home. Though the exact method remains uncertain, himself later hinted at the oven as the final stage, a place where the bodies were reduced to ash. Afterward, he moved her furniture and valuables, sometimes leaving the scene appearing undisturbed to neighbors and local authorities. The disappearance of Jean Couchet set a precedent. Landru studied her habits, finances, and personality with a surgeon's precision, learning how to select future victims with even greater efficiency. What makes Jean's story especially chilling is not merely her end, but the deliberate erasure of her existence, the way Landru ensured that no one could pinpoint what had happened. Letters he wrote to her family and acquaintances after her disappearance were filled with plausible lies, promising letters returned or money forwarded, while in reality he had stripped her life of its trace. Her jewelry and assets were absorbed into his growing collection, each item a trophy of deceit. Investigators later testified that the faint smell of burnt flesh might have emanated from chimneys during her stay, a signal missed by those who could have intervened. In essence, Jean's murder was the blueprint, the first fully realized execution of a pattern that would claim at least 10 more women. Landru's calm demeanor, attention to detail, and strategic isolation became his signature, a terrifying combination that made him invisible while the lives around him vanished. Her disappearance, initially explained away by letters and excuses, became the first ripple in a dark ocean of predation that would shock France once uncovered. The second known victim, Celestine Boisson, arrived at Landru's Gambé house with the same hope Jean Couchet had carried, a longing for security, a desire for stability in a turbulent world. Landru's method had evolved by now. He had perfected the art of deception. To Celestine, he presented himself as the consummate gentleman, a man of refinement and wealth, attentive to her needs, listening to her fears, her stories, and weaving a narrative that promised comfort and care. He ingratiated himself, noting every detail of her possessions, her financial situation, and the people in her life who might interfere. Once she was secured under his roof, Landru executed the familiar ritual of control, isolation, observation, and meticulous documentation. Every movement she made, every object she possessed, was logged in his infamous notebooks, a ledger of impending doom disguised as financial record-keeping. Unlike Jean, Celestine's disappearance involved a subtler psychological manipulation. Landru was careful to maintain appearances outside his home. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, her absence attributed to sudden visits to relatives or extended trips. Inside, Landru's cold, calculating nature surfaced. Evidence later suggested that, like Jean, she met her end within the confines of his home, her life extinguished in a manner meant to leave no body, no trace, only the carefully orchestrated illusion that she had vanished on her own accord. After her death, Landru claimed her assets, from modest savings to personal effects, weaving them seamlessly into his growing collection of stolen wealth. Letters sent to her acquaintances crafted a story of travel or misfortune, keeping suspicion at bay. The audacity of his method lay in its simplicity, charm, patience, and an unshakable sense of civility that masked the darkness beneath. Neighbors would later describe faint odors, unusual smoke, or occasional disturbances, but the cunning design of Landru's household ensured that nothing could be directly traced to him. Celestine's story reinforced a chilling truth about Landru. He was not driven merely by rage or impulse, but by a cold, meticulous pursuit of financial gain, perfected into a lethal art. Each victim became both a source of wealth and a test of his ability to manipulate perception. The execution of Celestine Boisson was more than murder. It was an orchestration of control, a demonstration of how invisible cruelty can operate within the most ordinary of facades, teaching a grim lesson about the dangers hidden behind civility and charm. Anna Callum, a widow with a modest inheritance, entered Landru's orbit with a vulnerability that he had learned to detect in every woman he targeted. She responded to one of his carefully worded matrimonial advertisements, unaware that beneath the polite phrases and affable charm lay a predator who had already mapped the pattern of her life. Landru's approach was always methodical, a veneer of respectability, calculated empathy, and a carefully maintained routine that convinced the woman she was under protection, not threat. Once Anna agreed to meet him, she was drawn into the same cycle that had claimed Jean Couchet and Celestine Busson. Landru invited her to Gambay, arranging travel logistics in a way that minimized his exposure while heightening her sense of dependency. Inside the house, Anna would have encountered the duality of Landru, a man outwardly kind, attentive to her comforts, while every move she made was being catalogued in meticulous detail. Her possessions, her savings, even her letters, were noted and categorized for future appropriation. In the shadows of the household, the machinery of her demise was quietly set in motion. Unlike his earlier victims, Landru had refined the psychological isolation he imposed. He created a sense of routine, normality, and subtle obligation that dulled any suspicion. Neighbors might hear the faint clatter of objects or smoke from the chimneys, but Landru's careful timing and attention to concealment ensured no one could directly connect him to a crime. Once Anna's life was ended, believed to have been within the house. Her body likely burned in the infamous oven. The financial spoils were claimed without hesitation. Jewelry, cash, and personal effects disappeared into his growing trove of stolen assets, each acquisition a testament to his cold precision. The letters and forged signatures he would later use to access her bank accounts highlighted not only his criminal ingenuity but the sinister elegance of his planning. Anna's story underscores the terrifying duality of Landru, outwardly courteous, inwardly calculating, able to manipulate and erase lives with bureaucratic efficiency. Each victim was not merely a target, but a carefully chosen element in a system designed to maximize gain while minimizing risk. A testament to a mind capable of turning civility into weaponry. In Anna Colombe's disappearance, we see the progression of a method, a blueprint of horror, and a chilling lesson about the hidden predator that can exist behind the most polite of masks. Marie-Therese Lemoine, a gentle soul seeking companionship in the turmoil of post-war Paris, became another entry in Landru's meticulously maintained ledger of human lives. Responding to one of his carefully crafted matrimonial notices, she stepped unknowingly into a trap that had already been rehearsed countless times. Landru's skill was in the illusion of normalcy, polite conversation, subtle charm, a sense of reassurance that cloaked his intent. He would arrange her journey to Gambay with precision, buying only his own return ticket while hers remained unaccounted for. A tiny detail that illustrates the calculated frugality behind his monstrous acts. Inside the house, Marie would have been treated to a paradoxical mixture of warmth and restriction. Landru ensured she felt observed yet safe, a psychological manipulation that disarmed suspicion. Every gesture, every request she made, was catalogued alongside her assets, her habits, and her routines. Unlike the hurried brutality one might imagine, Landru's murders were clinical, almost bureaucratic, executed with the same methodical planning one applies to ledgers or invoices. Once the decision was made, the act itself likely carried out within the privacy of the Gambay house. No visible trace to the casual observer. The oven, the chimney, and the hidden spaces of the home became instruments in a system of erasure where bodies could vanish while belongings were quietly assimilated. In Marie-Therese's case, as with the others, Landru maintained the outward facade of normal life. Correspondence sent to Paris, polite letters explaining her absence, forged signatures to maintain access to her accounts. Her disappearance was not a scream into the void, but a silent transfer of value from life to Landru's calculated dominion. Even those closest to her could not pierce the veil of civility, highlighting the terrifying duality of his existence. The public man, polite and unremarkable, versus the predator, meticulous and unflinching, who treated human lives as commodities to be catalogued, exploited, and destroyed. Marie-Thérèse's story illuminates the systematic nature of Landru's crimes. No panic, no mistakes, only precision and cold calculation. Each victim was a step deeper into a labyrinth of evil, revealing a mind obsessed not with passion but with control, not with chaos but with order. Through her fate, we witness the terrifying efficiency of a murderer who weaponized normalcy, leaving behind only the ghost of a life erased and a ledger of human value appropriated without conscience. Henri Landru's next victim, Célestine Busson, represents a chilling illustration of how he wove trust and deception into a lethal web. Célestine, a widow living with the scars of loss, sought stability in a world still recovering from the Great War. When she answered Landru's matrimonial advertisement, she had no idea that the man she would meet in Paris was calculating every movement, every word, every hesitation. He presented himself as a genteel suitor, an attentive listener, the embodiment of patience and subtle sophistication. Once he had gauged her routines, her assets, and her vulnerabilities, he orchestrated her journey to Gambé. Landru's methodology was consistent. He would buy only his own return ticket, ensuring that each victim became a one-way passenger into his private domain. Inside the house, Célestine's sense of security was meticulously manipulated. She encountered a home that appeared orderly and welcoming, yet every room, every corridor, carried the silent threat of her own erasure. Landru's actions were bureaucratic in their cruelty. Her letters, signatures, and personal accounts were methodically appropriated to maintain the illusion of her continued life while he extracted her resources. The murder itself, executed in the privacy of Gambé, left no immediate witnesses, and the tools of Horatia Tharvin, the hidden spaces ensured that her physical presence could vanish entirely. Friends and relatives noticed her absence, yet Landru's careful orchestration shielded him from suspicion. He maintained communication with Paris under the guise of propriety, responding to inquiries, forging correspondence, and keeping the illusion alive. Célestine's disappearance demonstrates the predator's mastery of psychological control. He exploited hope, grief, and the human yearning for connection to orchestrate death without overt violence in public view. Each act was calculated not only to remove life, but to absorb value, money, jewelry, documents into Landru's dominion. The chilling truth lies not only in the murder, but in the precision, the bureaucracy of annihilation. Landru was a man who transformed affection and trust into tools of predation, whose polite demeanor masked systematic cruelty. In Célestine's fate, we see the terrifying signature of a mind that operated like a ledger, a clockwork killer whose humanity was absent, replaced by an obsession with order, control, and profit. Her story, like those of the women before her, is a step deeper into the shadowed corridors of Landru's Gambé house, where every victim became both commodity and ghost, and every act of kindness a prelude to inevitable destruction. The case of Jean Couchet, Landru's next victim, exposes the predator's most intimate blend of manipulation and calculated ruthlessness. Jean, a widow of means, responded to Landru's matrimonial advertisement with a mix of hope and desperation that mirrored the vulnerability of post-war France. She was intelligent, cautious, and yet, like the others, blind to the subtle signals of predation. Landru's approach with Jean was both patient and insidious. He cultivated her trust with letters that balanced affection and financial prudence, letters that would later serve as evidence of the elaborate web he wove to entrap her. When she traveled to meet him, Jean encountered the familiar Foucault, a man of manners, sophistication, and apparent refinement. The Gambé house became a stage, every room designed to suggest safety and domestic normalcy while concealing the machinery of death. Landru's methods were horrifying in their He exploited Jean's routines, isolated her, and ensured that the networks of communication she might rely upon friends, family, and business associates were carefully intercepted or falsified. Her disappearance did not prompt immediate alarm. The letters and forged communications maintained the illusion of life. The theft of her jewelry and assets was executed with bureaucratic precision, while the physical erasure, the act of murder, was hidden behind closed doors, likely involving the infamous oven that would become his macabre signature, Jean's. Fate was not an impulsive act of violence, but a measured operation of elimination and extraction. Neighbors later reported strange smells, hints of decay that would eventually become pieces of circumstantial evidence, but during her life, manipulation was invisible, imperceptible, and complete. The chilling reality of Jean Couchet's story is that she was never targeted for passion, revenge, or rage. She was selected, studied, and removed for her resources, her vulnerability, and the calculated risk she presented. In her disappearance, we observe the full psychological machinery of Landru's operation: charm, patience, deceit, and the cold efficiency of murder designed to leave no trace. Each step he took was deliberate, each interaction a thread in the tapestry of control. By examining Jean's fate, we gain insight into a mind that did not merely kill but engineered absence. A predator whose power lay not in brute force but in the invisible, methodical orchestration of destruction, and the haunting reality that life and death could be administered with the detached precision of a ledger and a letter. Anna Column's story is one that chills even seasoned historians of crime, a testament to Landru's cold precision and merciless methodology. Anna, a quiet widow in her 40s, had already endured the hardship of loss, yet her hope for companionship made her the perfect mark. Landru's letters, crafted with the same meticulous care as those sent to previous victims, offered her affection, guidance, and the promise of stability, a life rebuilt under the careful tutelage of a man whose veneer of civility masked monstrous intent. She traveled to Gambé, unaware that the house she believed to be a sanctuary was a chamber of meticulous erasure. Once inside, Landru implemented the same sinister routine: isolation, subtle manipulation, and the orchestration of her disappearance in such a way that no immediate alarm would be raised. Letters were forged, accounts emptied, and the sense of life maintained artificially, creating a delayed realization that she had vanished. Neighbors would later recall faint odors, unexplained activity, and the unusual movement of furniture and goods, but at the time, Anna was swallowed by the careful design of Landru's predation. The murder itself, as with Jean Couchet, likely involved the infamous oven, a tool transformed from domestic utility into an instrument of concealment and death. Landru's approach was never violent in the public sense. It was strategic, almost clinical, executed with the precision of someone who understood that power lay in planning, patience, and the untraceable movement of bodies. The theft of Anna's assets mirrored the procedure applied to his other victims, blending greed with the macabre artistry of control. She was more than a name on a ledger. Anna became a component of a larger, terrifying system that relied on deception, social isolation, and psychological domination. The horror lies not merely in her death, but in the invisible architecture of it. A man who could transform letters, domestic gestures, and human trust into instruments of obliteration. In Anna Column's disappearance, we see the apex of Landru's methodology, a crime that is hidden in plain sight, shielded by civility, and rationalized through manipulation. Her story is a blueprint of predation, a window into a mind capable of turning ordinary human interactions into a theater of disappearance, leaving behind only empty chairs, silent homes, and a ledger that marked life and death with terrifying precision. When Henri Désiré Landru's trial opened on the 7th of November 1921, Versailles became a stage for a drama that blurred the line between justice and morbid fascination, a spectacle the world had not witnessed in decades. From the first moment he entered the courtroom, Landru exuded the same unsettling calm that had defined his life, polished, witty, polite to a fault, a man who smiled while his crimes hung like shadows over every seat. Newspapers had sensationalized every detail: missing women, mysterious disappearances, and the whispered accounts of a household filled with deception and death. Spectators arrived in daily trainloads, dubbed the Landru specials, their curiosity blending with fear, each one eager to glimpse the man who had allegedly seduced, swindled, and murdered dozens of women with methodical precision. Inside the courtroom, celebrities and ordinary citizens alike crowded the benches, eager to witness this convergence of civility and monstrosity. The prosecution, led by Robert Godefroy, faced a daunting challenge. Physical evidence was circumstantial at best. Burned bone fragments found in a pond, testimony from neighbors describing horrific odors, and the belongings of missing women in Landru's possession painted a grim portrait. Yet no bodies had been conclusively identified. Landru's defense. Lawyer Vincent de Moreau-Jafferi, a man renowned for his brilliance in court, recognized the delicate balance. His client was likely guilty, but without definitive proof of murder, the guillotine could not claim him without doubt. Moreau crafted a strategy rooted in the ambiguity of evidence, casting suspicion on forensic procedures, highlighting investigative inconsistencies, and proposing lurid alternatives that suggested victims might have been spirited away rather than killed. Landru himself played his role to perfection, charming the gallery, offering polite gestures, witty asides, and subtly undermining every assertion made against him without appearing hostile. Witnesses spoke, often shaking the courtroom with the weight of their accounts, but Landru's presence absorbed their shock. His unshakable demeanor, a psychological counterattack, unsettling jurors as much as spectators. The atmosphere was a mix of fear, fascination, and disbelief, an environment where morality, justice, and curiosity collided. Every glance, every comment, every polite smile became part of a game Landru played with his audience. A reminder that true evil often hides behind the most ordinary of faces. By the final day, the jury had witnessed months of testimony, evidence, and manipulation, and they were forced to confront the unthinkable, the possibility that a man could live among society's rules while orchestrating horrors behind closed doors. A predator invisible in plain sight. On the 30th of November 1921, after 3 weeks of testimony, A trial that had captivated Paris and stretched the imagination of every witness and juror alike reached its fateful conclusion. The jury deliberated for a mere 3 hours, a brief interlude. Before the irrevocable judgment, Henri Désiré Landru was found guilty of all 11 murders attributed to him, and the thefts of his victims' property were confirmed almost unanimously. The courtroom, which had been a theatre of suspense, erupted in tension and murmurs. But Landru remained impassive, his signature calm, unsettling to all who expected a final confession or breakdown. Despite the overwhelming public conviction of his guilt, Landru himself maintained his narrative of denial, an unsettling assertion of control even as the machinery of justice closed in. The tribunal has made a mistake. I have never killed anyone. This is my final protest, he declared, refusing clemency initially, his words carrying both defiance and chilling indifference. Vincent de Moura-Jaffery, who had fought to save him from the guillotine, petitioned for mercy on Landru's behalf, emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the evidence and the possibility of reasonable doubt. Landru eventually allowed his name to be included in the appeal, though he remained cold and detached, a man seemingly immune to fear, regret, or the gravity of his impending execution. Outside, crowds had gathered for weeks, drawn by morbid curiosity, their fascination with Landru's polite, almost gentlemanly evil magnified by newspapers that sensationalized every detail. The French press had elevated him to a figure of notoriety, and thousands sent him letters, gifts, and even marriage proposals, enmeshing Landru in a bizarre cult of admiration that blurred the lines between crime and celebrity. In the days leading to his execution, officials prepared meticulously, knowing that public interest was as dangerous as it was intense. The guillotine, ironically nicknamed the Widow, awaited him, a machine of death that would render him silent and ultimately unremarkable. His reputation surviving long after his body had been buried in an unmarked grave. Landru's final hours were a testament to his psychological mastery. He refused alcohol, last rites, and any final confessions, calmly conversing with priests and guards alike, instructing them on matters unrelated to his crimes, as if his mind remained impervious to the horror he had unleashed. The world would watch, and even in death, Henri Désiré Landru would remain a symbol of cunning, charm, and the terrifying possibility of evil existing under the guise of civility. The morning of the 25th of February 1922 broke cold over Versailles, a pale light reflecting off the cobblestones of the prison Saint-Pierre. Henri Désiré Landru, escorted with deliberate calm, stepped into the courtyard where the guillotine awaited, a grim monument to both justice and spectacle. Witnesses described his gait as measured, almost casual, bare feet whispering against the stone, knees bending with mechanical precision, a man performing the final act of a play only he fully understood. Around him, officials, guards, and journalists arranged themselves, the crowd barred yet palpable beyond the walls, murmurs of anticipation pressing against the prison gates. The blade, polished to a deadly gleam, loomed above him, nicknamed the Widow, as if fate itself mocked his victims. Landru's final requests were peculiar. He refused strong alcohol, declined last rites, and asked only for a simple glass of rum and water, or, in another account, a foot bath, gestures of control, even in the face of annihilation. When the moment came, Landru's head fell into the waiting basket with a muted thud, a sound almost drowned by the collective tension of those who watched. An assistant rolled the headless torso into a wicker basket. blood gushing in a sickening torrent, while another transported the body to a cart. The entire execution complete in under half a minute, yet in that brevity, time seemed suspended. One journalist famously checked his watch and recorded only 26 seconds passing from courtyard entrance to departure. Outside the prison, the public's morbid fascination had not waned. Women, some still in the finery of Parisian nightclubs, pressed against the gates, eager to glimpse the aftermath of a man who had seduced, defrauded, and murdered with meticulous precision. In death, Landru's notoriety was cemented, a spectacle that blurred justice with theatre. Newspapers the next day carried every macabre detail, photographs of the guillotine, sketches of his oven, and even reproductions of his meticulous ledgers, reminding the world of the chilling order behind his chaos. The auction of his possessions followed. Items once belonging to the murdered women now treated as public curiosities. His oven sold for a sum reflecting both horror and fascination. Landru had vanished, yet the shadow of his deeds lingered, haunting both the judicial system that tried him and the society that had, unknowingly, enabled him. His life, crimes, and the execution that ended it remained a lesson in human deception. The terrifying intersection of charm, greed, and the cold logic of a predator. Even after Henri Désiré Landru's execution, the story did not end. It metastasized, twisting through time and memory, resurfacing in whispers, headlines, and the occasional excavation of his old properties. In March 1933, over a decade after his death, demolition crews in Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris, unearthed a skeleton beneath the kitchen floor of a house neighboring one Landru had occupied. The discovery sent a shiver through the authorities, the press, and those who had never forgotten the Bluebeard of Gambay. Forensic methods were rudimentary by today's standards, yet the skeletal remains, a young woman's bones, hinted at the possibility that Landru's reach had extended further than the 11 murders for which he was convicted. The French authorities kept tight control over the investigation, but rumor and speculation surged like wildfire. Some claimed these were the remains of Jean Couchet, or perhaps another victim who had never been traced. Decades later, in 1958, further excavations at Landru's Gambay residence revealed partial skeletons of 2 individuals, suspected to be Jean Couchet and her young son. The eerie precision with which Landru had selected, defrauded, and allegedly murdered his victims became all too real. The meticulous man had not left his crimes entirely hidden, but buried them beneath walls and beneath the earth, as if confident in the impossibility of discovery. Even more chilling was the claim that a preserved head, purportedly Landru's, found its way to the Museum of Death in Hollywood, California, a grotesque testament to the public's fascination with true crime and morbid curiosity. Newspapers, in 1963, reignited the fire, publishing what they called Landru's confession, allegedly scribbled on the back of a sketch of his infamous oven. The words were terse, cryptic, yet terrifyingly explicit. Things didn't happen behind the wall, rather something was burned inside the oven. Some reports claimed he had written, "I did it. I burned the women's bodies in the kitchen." Oven? Each variation implied the same cold truth. A man who had cultivated a domestic facade, a family life, and a reputation as a charming suitor, had simultaneously orchestrated unimaginable horror within the privacy of his own home. His methods were precise, methodical, economical, calculated to evade suspicion, yet always leaving the faintest trace for those bold enough to dig. The aura of Landru's crimes became a mirror reflecting society's fascination with cunning, evil, the ease with which charm and civility can conceal predation, and the terrifying reality that monstrosity can dwell behind the most ordinary mask to understand. Henri Désiré Landru is to stare into the mechanics of a mind that balanced civility with cruelty, charm with calculation, and domesticity with annihilation. He was not a man driven by sudden rage or passion. He operated like a surgeon dissecting human behavior for profit and opportunity. Observers often described him as physically unremarkable, short, balding, stout, and yet somehow magnetic, a paradoxical presence that inspired trust even as he plotted destruction. His appeal was subtle, a paternal demeanor, an air of cultured sophistication, gestures of politeness, a smile that suggested protection and stability. Women, many of them widows or isolated in the uncertainty of post-war France, saw in Landru the security of a stable relationship, the promise of companionship, and the allure of being chosen. But beneath this veneer, Landru catalogued, calculated, and classified potential victims with chilling precision. Letters were sorted meticulously, reply by general delivery. No money, probably has property, reserve, further investigation needed. Each category reflected a mind obsessed with assets, risk assessment, and minimizing exposure. Once a target was chosen, he executed a strategy that blended persuasion, deception, and ultimately elimination. He offered comfort, feigned affection, and manipulated vulnerability, all while maintaining an unassailable calm, the face of normalcy, the mask of civility. Landru's psychological control extended beyond his victims. Even his own family existed. In a parallel world, to his wife and children, he was the thoughtful paterfamilias, a provider, a man whose income and gifts appeared legitimate, though they were tainted by theft and blood. His family's complicity was limited, mostly tied to financial assistance or unwitting participation. But he maintained an iron separation between the horrors of Gambay and the ordinary rhythm of home life. This compartmentalization, the ability to live two lives without a twitch of moral contradiction, is what makes Landru's mind so profoundly unsettling. It is the hallmark of a predator who understood human psychology, societal blind spots, and institutional limitations, exploiting all with surgical precision. In examining Landru, one confronts a dangerous truth. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, smiles, and sits quietly across a table, calculating, patient, and invisible until the consequences are irreversibly devastating. His mind is a blueprint of manipulation, a manual in behavioral engineering, and a testament to the terrifying potential of intellect without conscience. The courtroom in Versailles became a theatre of macabre fascination when Henri Désiré Landru finally faced judgment. From the very first day, the 7th of November, 1921. The trial was more spectacle than solemnity, a gathering of curiosity, fear, and morbid fascination. The press amplified every detail, and the government may have quietly encouraged the circus, using the case to divert attention from post-war politics and the ongoing Paris Peace Conference. Spectators arrived in trainloads, the so-called Landru special, turning the trial into a pilgrimage for those eager to witness depravity at close range. The gallery overflowed, celebrities and commoners alike crowding every inch, their eyes fixed on a man whose calm demeanor, wry smile, and measured politeness belied the horror he was accused of. Landru did not perform like a criminal. He performed like a conductor, orchestrating subtle gestures, bow to a lady, an offered seat, an ironic joke to maintain control, charm, and ambiguity. His notoriety fed a public obsession. Fan mail arrived, gifts were sent, and marriage proposals poured in, a chilling testament to the seductive power of charisma combined with evil. Yet beneath the theatrics lay a legal puzzle. The prosecution faced a monumental challenge. They had no complete corpses, only circumstantial evidence. Bone fragments and traces of cremation were disputed, witness testimonies clashed, and the meticulous record-keeping Landru left behind could be explained as prudence rather than proof of murder. His defense, led by the formidable Vincent de Morigeferi, exploited every gap. Moreau painted a picture of uncertainty, questioned the reliability of forensic methods, suggested the possibility of alternative fates for the women, and highlighted inconsistencies in police reports. He even proposed that Landru's victims had been spirited abroad, a grotesque but plausible alternative that forced doubt into the jury's mind. Every statement, every gesture in the courtroom was a calculated battle for perception. Landru understood this deeply. He denied the murders with icy consistency, implicitly admitting fraud but refusing the full moral confession, maintaining a psychological grip over the proceedings. Public fascination collided with juridical ambiguity, leaving the city suspended between horror and fascination, as Landru became both the accused and the performer, the criminal and the spectacle. The trial transformed into an exploration of societal weakness, institutional limitations, and the disturbing allure of a man who weaponized civility to conceal monstrous intent. On the 30th of November 1921, the courtroom held its breath as the jury returned after only 3 hours of deliberation. The verdict was a brutal confirmation of what the public already sensed. Henri Désiré Landru was guilty of all 11 murders, a 9-3 majority sealing his fate. He was simultaneously convicted on numerous theft charges, a financial greed woven seamlessly with his lethal cunning. Yet even in this moment of judgment, Landru remained composed, almost eerily so, acknowledging the verdict without surrendering his narrative. He refused to plead for clemency initially, insisting on the truth of his innocence regarding the murders. The tribunal has made a mistake. I have never killed anyone. This is my final protest. His calm defiance, the arrogance of a man who had meticulously orchestrated every deception, shocked spectators who had anticipated a break of spirit. Only under pressure from his lawyer did he eventually consent to a clemency appeal, a final, futile attempt to save a life the law had determined to take. Outside the courtroom, the fascination with Landru only intensified. The press covered every detail, analyzing his words, his gestures, the subtle inflections of humor or evasion, turning a legal process into a theater of morbid psychology. This public obsession blurred the lines between horror and celebrity, a dangerous mix of fascination and fear that made Landru both monster and myth. Behind the veneer of politeness and refined charm, the jury had glimpsed the machinery of a mind calculated for exploitation. Landru's methodical selection of victims, the meticulous notes of property, income, and potential vulnerability, spoke to a predator who treated human lives as currency, every detail mapped and controlled. Even as justice was pronounced, questions lingered, shadows of doubt that would haunt historians and crime enthusiasts for decades. How many bodies truly passed through the oven? Which remains would never be found? Which witnesses had been deceived? Which truths had been buried under meticulous charm? As Landru left the courtroom, escorted by guards, he carried not only the weight of his crimes, but the heavy fascination of a society enthralled by evil rendered polite, evil cloaked in civility, evil that mocked the law itself. The machinery of the court could not, and perhaps never could, fully capture the darkness he embodied. This was a man who had turned murder into method, greed into strategy, and charisma into camouflage. The trial had ended, but the story, the dark narrative of manipulation, death, and forbidden knowledge had only just entered public consciousness. A lesson in the terrifying effectiveness of calculated evil hidden behind the facade of normalcy. Before dawn on the 25th of February 1922, Henri Désiré Landru faced the guillotine, a machine of merciless finality that would separate his head from his body in less than half a minute. The night was thick with the tension that stretched into Versailles as whispers of anticipation, and morbid curiosity spread through the town. Only officials and journalists were permitted inside the prison grounds. Yet rumors of onlookers lingering outside, hoping for a glimpse of the condemned, grew into a dark legend of spectacle. Landru, ever composed, showed no tremor of fear. He declined strong liquor, refused last rites, and maintained a calm detachment as if the world beyond the prison gates had ceased to exist. His final requests were strangely mundane: a glass of rum and water, perhaps a footbath, gestures revealing the subtle human vulnerabilities behind a predator's mask. The guillotine, ironically nicknamed the Widow, awaited him, a grim symbol that in life he had created dozens of widows, and in death one would claim him. As he approached, the rhythm of his bare feet on the cold pebbles was light, almost casual, betraying no hint of panic. The blade fell in an instant, and in 26 seconds, Henri Désiré Landru, the man who had charmed, deceived, and murdered, was gone, his head rolling into a basket as the blood of finality spilled forth. The efficiency, the cold precision of the execution mirrored the meticulous calculation of his crimes, a poetic, terrifying symmetry between method and justice. Outside, the public fascination only intensified, his possessions soon auctioned, some morbidly preserved as reminders of the man who had captivated and horrified France. The oven, believed to have consumed the remains of his victims, changed hands multiple times, slipping into private collections, a relic of unspeakable acts that no display could truly convey. Decades later, the discovery of partial skeletons, of a preserved head claimed to be Landru's, continued to keep the shadow of his crimes alive. Evidence that death had not erased the fear, the questions, the fascination. Landru had achieved a form of immortality not through fame, but through infamy, a dark legend etched into history, a case that blurred the line between criminal and myth, between grotesque reality and the curiosity of human minds that crave understanding of ultimate evil. His life, crimes, and death became a lesson in the terrifying power of calculated charm, in the seductive danger of civility hiding monstrous intent, and in the lingering question that would haunt generations: how could one man orchestrate such destruction under the guise of normalcy? Even decades after his death, Henri Désiré Landru's shadow refused to fade. The houses he had inhabited, the streets he had walked, became haunted landscapes, whispering the memory of his crimes to anyone willing or foolish enough to listen. In 1933, when a house near one of Landru's former residences in Saint was demolished, workers unearthed a skeleton of a young woman beneath the kitchen floor. Her presence, an unspoken confirmation that his monstrous acts might extend beyond the known victims. Years later, in 1958, during an excavation at his Gambay residence, partial skeletons of two individuals emerged, suspected to be Jean Couchet and her son. Chilling reminders that some victims' fates would never be fully documented. These discoveries added layers of horror and unanswered questions. How many lives had Landru erased without leaving a trace? How many families were left fractured by the vanishing of daughters, mothers, and sisters? The psychological weight of his actions lingered in public imagination, fueling morbid fascination, grotesque curiosity, and an uneasy acknowledgement of how meticulously human evil can operate undetected. Museums displayed pieces of his life, personal belongings, sketches, and even the preserved head claimed to be his, allowing the public a macabre, almost intimate encounter with a figure who had manipulated civility into a weapon. Landru's notoriety inspired other criminals. John Hay, the acid bath murderer in 1940s England, reportedly studied Landru's methods, understanding that concealment of evidence could create near-impervious immunity to law enforcement. The chilling lesson echoed across borders and generations: a calculating mind, a veneer of respectability, and the strategic exploitation of human trust can transform ordinary spaces into theaters of death. Yet beneath the shock and revulsion, there is a psychological truth that Landru's story forces us to confront: a lesson about perception, charm, and the thin line between civility and predation. To understand Landru is not only to catalogue his murders or study his trial, but to examine how society, mesmerized by surface appearances, fails to perceive subtle malevolence until it is too late. Comment below right now the phrase, "I see the hidden truth," twice, wherever you are watching from, and let it anchor you in awareness. A symbolic recognition that history's darkest knowledge is also a warning. By acknowledging the invisible threats, by tracing the cold, methodical paths of someone like Landru, we start to learn something about human nature, the fragility of trust, and the terrifying power of methodical greed. This is no mere historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting what lies dormant, what can awaken in any world where appearances obscure reality, and where charm masks the machinery of death. To truly grasp the horror of Henri Désiré Landru, you must step inside his mind, a labyrinth of cold calculation and moral inversion. He presented himself as the perfect gentleman, polite, refined, even charming to those who knew him superficially. Yet behind this veneer, he wove a meticulous network of manipulation designed to ensnare women into his fatal orbit. Each victim was catalogued, assessed for property, naivete, and vulnerability. His notebook seized at the time of arrest reveal the terrifying precision of his greed. Notes of train fares, furniture costs, jewelry valuations, even trivial expenses alongside the assets extracted from those he would later dispose of. Landru's genius lay in his ability to separate the ordinary from the monstrous. He maintained an outwardly ordinary family life, yet behind closed doors orchestrated murders with the cold logic of a man balancing ledgers, not lives. The psychological control extended beyond mere deception. He exploited loneliness, social isolation, and the post-war desperation of women, presenting himself as a protector, a suitor, a reliable guide through uncertain times. Victims were drawn to him willingly, believing in safety and companionship, blind to the predator beneath the surface. He used patience as a weapon, cultivating trust, prolonging interaction, and studying reactions before striking. His murder method was calculated, not impulsive strangulation followed by cremation in his oven. The ultimate act of erasing presence, of leaving no trace, ensuring that his control over life and death remained absolute. This was a system of psychological domination disguised as civility. A horrifying blueprint for predation that thrives under the radar of societal suspicion. Even during the trial, his mind remained unassailable, calm, witty, refusing confession, politely dismissive of guilt. He understood that true power lay in perception, in the narrative others construct about him. Landru's case teaches a chilling truth, that evil can be methodical, bureaucratic, and socially invisible. That charm can be weaponized. That human systems of trust, law, and propriety can be manipulated by those who understand them deeply. Every ledger entry, every polite gesture, every fabricated story served a single purpose: to extend his dominion over life and death while maintaining the illusion of respectability. In facing Landru, we confront a dangerous lesson about human psychology, the seductive nature of authority, and the fragility of trust. His crimes are not just historical, they are an anatomy of manipulation, a guide to understanding how seemingly ordinary men can cultivate extraordinary evil. Comment below where you are watching from, and reflect. I see the hidden truth. Type it twice. Ground yourself in recognition, because the knowledge of such minds is as intoxicating as it is terrifying. The trial of Henri Désiré Landru was less a courtroom proceeding, and more a theatre of human fascination, a spectacle that revealed not just the man, but the collective obsession with forbidden darkness. On the 7th of November 1921, Versailles became a stage for an event no one could ignore. As Paris sent trainloads of spectators eager to witness the trial of a man they already imagined as a monster, the courtroom overflowed, double its capacity. Celebrities and curious citizens alike pressed in, driven by morbid curiosity and the thrill of proximity to evil. Landru himself contributed to the theatre, exuding calm politeness, offering seats to ladies, replying with wit, never losing composure, never confessing. Every word, every gesture was a performance of control, a demonstration of his understanding that perception could be as lethal as action. The prosecution, led by Robert Godefroy, faced a haunting obstacle. Bodies were scarce, definitive proof elusive. Bone fragments were circumstantial, witness statements conflicted, yet the narrative of horror was irresistible. Neighbors recalled the stench of decay, the disappearance of women who had trusted him, the strange disposal of their belongings. The defense, masterfully led by Vincent de Montgiféry, exploited these gaps with surgical precision, painting alternative scenarios, questioning the integrity of evidence, suggesting that even the idea of murder might be misattributed or fabricated. Moreau's oratory was mesmerizing, turning the courtroom into a battlefield of perception, hinting at white slavery, secret transports, and the unreliability of human testimony. Yet, the public's perception was uncontrollable. Newspapers fanned the flames, cartoons, songs, and jokes immortalized Landru, nicknaming him Bluebeard and the Lady Killer, mixing horror with fascination. Letters poured in, marriage proposals arrived, and nearly 4,000 voters inscribed his name in the 1919 election, as if the line between criminal infamy and celebrity had dissolved entirely. After 3 tense hours of deliberation on the 30th of November, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of 11 murders, 9-3, and unanimously guilty of theft. Moreau, ever the strategist, obtained a petition for clemency, which Landru initially rejected, claiming innocence to the bitter end. The trial illustrated a terrifying truth. Society is both repelled and enthralled by the predator it cannot fully comprehend, and in the theatre of justice, perception can sway emotion as powerfully. As evidence, the stage was set for the final act, execution, spectacle, and the chilling closure that would etch Landru's legend into history. Before dawn, on the 25th of February, 1922, Henri Désiré Landru walked toward the guillotine outside the gates of prison. Saint-Pierre in Versailles, a place where his fate would be sealed. And the last whispers of his carefully cultivated control would vanish in a single, irrevocable moment. A crowd had gathered in the darkness, drawn by morbid curiosity, yet only officials and journalists were permitted entry. Landru's calm persisted, his hands steady, his demeanor polite, almost courteous, as if the ritual before death were merely another social engagement. He refused the last rites, dismissing the priest with words that froze even hardened observers. Worry about saving your own soul rather than mine. Some accounts claim he requested a glass of rum and water. Others suggest a foot bath. Each request underscored his meticulous detachment, his control over even the final, irrevocable moments of life. The guillotine, ominously nicknamed the Widow, waited silently. Its blade, a cold instrument of state justice, a paradoxical partner to the man who had spared none. When the executioner released the blade, Landru's head fell with a dull, final thud. Webb Miller, witnessing the act, recorded the horror with clinical precision. 26 seconds passed from courtyard to the loaded cart. A brief, incomprehensible span in which a man who had toyed with lives disappeared into history. Yet death did not erase fascination. Landru's possessions were auctioned in Versailles. His Gambé house briefly became a morbidly themed restaurant. His oven, believed to have incinerated victims, changed hands, vanished into private collections, becoming a talisman of forbidden knowledge. Decades later, fragments of bones and hidden remains emerged, hinting at truths that authorities could never fully account for. Newspapers published alleged confessions found hidden in sketches, cryptic admissions that confirmed the horrors only whispered at trial. Landru's meticulous record-keeping, his cold accounting of victims' possessions, his careful selection and manipulation of women, his calm demeanor through investigation and trial all coalesce into a portrait of a predator who understood society's blind spots and exploited them with surgical precision. He became both legend and warning, a man who embodied the dangerous intersection of charm, intelligence, and moral vacancy. His story forces a question that haunts those willing to stare into the abyss. How many predators walk among us, veiled in civility, hidden by the thin veneer of normalcy? Their control so complete it seems supernatural. Reflect on this, and understand that knowledge itself carries a burden. Comment below, "I see the hidden twice," if you feel the weight of this revelation, and share from where you are watching. This is more than history. It is a lesson in vigilance, in understanding the dark potential within the human mind. Like, share, and subscribe to uncover the truths buried beneath society's facade. And remember, the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than you dare imagine. To truly grasp the horror of Henri Désiré Landru, you must step inside his mind, a labyrinth of cold calculation and moral inversion. He presented himself as the perfect gentleman, polite, refined, even charming to those who knew him superficially. Yet behind this veneer, he wove a meticulous network of manipulation designed to ensnare women into his fatal orbit. Each victim was catalogued, assessed for property, navit, and vulnerability. His notebook seized at the time of arrest revealed the terrifying precision of his greed. Notes of train fares, furniture costs, jewelry valuations, even trivial expenses alongside the assets extracted from those he would later dispose of. Landru's genius lay in his ability to separate the ordinary from the monstrous. He maintained an outwardly ordinary family life, yet behind closed doors orchestrated murders with the cold logic of a man balancing ledgers, not lives. The psychological control extended beyond mere deception. He exploited loneliness, social isolation, and the post-war desperation of women, presenting himself as a protector, a suitor, a reliable guide through uncertain times. Victims were drawn to him willingly, believing in safety and companionship, blind to the predator beneath the surface. He used patience as a weapon, cultivating trust, prolonging interaction, and studying reactions before striking. His murder method was calculated, not impulsive strangulation followed by cremation in his oven. The ultimate act of erasing presence, of leaving no trace, ensuring that his control over life and death remained absolute. This was a system of psychological domination disguised as civility, a horrifying blueprint for predation that thrives under the radar of societal suspicion. Even during the trial, his mind remained unassailable, calm, witty, refusing confession, politely dismissive of guilt. He understood that true power lay in perception, in the narrative others construct about him. Landru's case teaches a chilling truth, that evil can be methodical, bureaucratic, and socially invisible. That charm can be weaponized, that human systems of trust, law, and propriety can be manipulated by those who understand them deeply. Every ledger entry, every polite gesture, every fabricated story served a single purpose: to extend his dominion over life and death while maintaining the illusion of respectability. In facing Landru, we confront a dangerous lesson about human psychology, the seductive nature of authority, and the fragility of trust. His crimes are not just historical, they are an anatomy of manipulation, a guide to understanding how seemingly ordinary men can cultivate extraordinary evil. Comment below where you are watching from and reflect. I see the hidden truth. Type it twice. Ground yourself in recognition, because the knowledge of such minds is as intoxicating as it is terrifying. The trial of Henri Désiré Landru was less a courtroom proceeding and more a theater of human fascination, a spectacle that revealed not just the man, but the collective obsession with forbidden darkness. On the 7th of November 1921, Versailles became a stage for an event no one could ignore. As Paris sent trainloads of spectators eager to witness the trial of a man they already imagined as a monster, the courtroom overflowed, double its capacity. Celebrities and curious citizens alike pressed in, driven by morbid curiosity and the thrill of proximity to evil. Landru himself contributed to the theater, exuding calm politeness, offering seats to ladies, replying with wit, never losing composure, never confessing. Every word, every gesture was a performance of control, a demonstration of his understanding that perception could be as lethal as action. The prosecution, led by Robert Godefroy, faced a haunting obstacle. Bodies were scarce, definitive proof elusive. Bone fragments were circumstantial, witness statements conflicted, yet the narrative of horror was irresistible. Neighbors recalled the stench of decay, the disappearance of women who had trusted him, the strange disposal of their belongings. The defense, masterfully led by Vincent de Montbrun, exploited these gaps with surgical precision, painting alternative scenarios, questioning the integrity of evidence, suggesting that even the idea of murder might be misattributed or fabricated. Moreau's oratory was mesmerizing, turning the courtroom into a battlefield of perception, hinting at white slavery, secret transports, and the unreliability of human testimony. Yet the public's perception was uncontrollable. Newspapers fanned the flames, cartoons, songs, and jokes immortalized Landru, nicknaming him Bluebeard and the Lady Killer, mixing horror with fascination. Letters poured in, marriage proposals arrived, and nearly 4,000 voters inscribed his name in the 1919 election, as if the line between criminal infamy and celebrity had dissolved entirely. After 3 tense hours of deliberation on the 30th of November, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of 11 murders, 9-3, and unanimously guilty of theft. Moreau, ever the strategist, obtained a petition for clemency, which Landru initially rejected, claiming innocence to the bitter end. The trial illustrated a terrifying truth. Society is both repelled and enthralled by the predator it cannot fully comprehend. And in the theater of justice, perception can sway emotion as powerfully. As evidence, the stage was set for the final act, execution, spectacle, and the chilling closure that would etch Landru's legend into history. Before dawn on the 25th of February 1922, Henri Désiré Landru walked toward the guillotine outside the gates of prison. Saint-Pierre in Versailles, a place where his fate would be sealed, and the last whispers of his carefully cultivated control would vanish in a single, irrevocable moment. A crowd had gathered in the darkness, drawn by morbid curiosity, yet only officials and journalists were permitted entry. Landru's calm persisted, his hands steady, his demeanor polite, almost courteous, as if the ritual before death were merely another social engagement. He refused last rites, dismissing the priest with words that froze even hardened observers. Worry about saving your own soul rather than mine. Some accounts claim he requested a glass of rum and water. Others suggest a foot bath. Each request underscored his meticulous detachment, his control over even the final, irrevocable moments of life. The guillotine, ominously nicknamed the Widow, waited silently, its blade a cold instrument of state justice, a paradoxical partner to the man who had spared none. When the executioner released the blade, Landru's head fell with a dull, final thud. Webb Miller, witnessing the act, recorded the horror with clinical precision. 26 seconds passed from courtyard to the loaded cart. A brief, incomprehensible span in which a man who had toyed with lives disappeared into history. Yet death did not erase fascination. Landru's possessions were auctioned in Versailles. His Gambay house briefly became a morbidly themed restaurant. His oven, believed to have incinerated victims, changed hands, vanished into private collections, becoming a talisman of forbidden knowledge. Decades later, fragments of bones and hidden remains emerged, hinting at truths that authorities could never fully account for. Newspapers published alleged confessions found hidden in sketches, cryptic admissions that confirmed the horrors only whispered at trial. Landru's meticulous record-keeping, his cold accounting of victims' possessions, his careful selection and manipulation of women, his calm demeanor through investigation and trial all coalesce into a portrait of a predator who understood society's blind spots and exploited them with surgical precision. He became both legend and warning, a man who embodied the dangerous intersection of charm, intelligence, and moral vacancy. His story forces a question that haunts those willing to stare into the abyss. How many predators walk among us, veiled in civility, hidden by the thin veneer of normalcy? Their control so complete it seems supernatural. Reflect on this, and understand that knowledge itself carries a burden. Comment below, "I see the hidden twice," if you feel the weight of this revelation, and share from where you are watching. This is more than history. It is a lesson in vigilance, in understanding the dark potential within the human mind. Like, share, and subscribe to uncover the truths buried beneath society's facade. And remember, the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than you dare imagine.